Audio works. That was Rich destroying the fax machine.
What?
I'm giving you shit, don't worry.
What? Going, what did I do now?
Hello, everybody. Welcome to our discussion today on epilepsy and medical marijuana. Medical marijuana has been approved in New York State for use in patients with epilepsy, and several pharmaceutical companies
Keep talking.
several pharmaceutical companies have been applying for use of various forms of medical marijuana in certain types of epilepsy. One of the syndromes that a company called GW Pharma has applied for its use in is Dravet syndrome, which is a severe form of childhood epilepsy, which ultimately causes significant amount of mental retardation in children and disability in young kids. It has been shown to be efficacious or useful in children with Dravet syndrome. The trials are ongoing, and the medicine is available in New York State and in other states for patients with Dravet syndrome, a severe form of childhood epilepsy. It is being planned to be utilized in other types of epilepsies, in clinical trials, and potentially in compassionate use.
Is medical marijuana viable for all forms of epilepsy or only some?
Well, the question from the audience is medical marijuana viable for all forms of epilepsy or only certain types? Epilepsy, in its core, has a similar structural and electrical abnormality in the brain, where there's a short-circuiting of the brain neurons that ultimately result in the neurons misfiring, like a short-circuiting of an electrical wire in your house or in your car, and that can result in the entire brain shutting off. For some unknown reason, medical marijuana in epilepsy stimulates a CBD1 receptor. It's called C as in cat, B as in boy, D as in David, number 1 receptor in the brain, which somehow controls the transmission of the short circuiting so it doesn't spread to the entire part of the brain. Currently, the only hard data that we have is in Dravet syndrome, which is a childhood epilepsy, which is severe, where kids can have dozens of seizures a day. And the current medical marijuana that is being tested has reduced those seizures significantly in many kids to where it's only 1 or maybe less than 1 a day. The natural inference is to consider it to be useful in other forms of epilepsy. And from a common sense perspective, it is possible. It is being studied in other forms of epilepsy. There are numerous anecdotal data that is published in the literature and in the web of patients who have added this medicine onto their current epilepsy regime. That means that you can't stop the current medications. You just add it on there to improve your control. If you, on this current medication cocktail, are having several seizures a week, the theoretical and common sense implication is that epilepsy patients of that type, when they start medical marijuana, will have a reduction in their seizure frequency by 25, 30, 40, 50% or more.
Would you consider adding medical marijuana by default to an epileptic's drug regimen?
I would consider that in New York State, if they're on 2 or more drugs for more than 3 months and have had no significant improvement in their seizure frequency, and the seizures that do occur are functionally impairing them. So the question again was, would I consider adding medical marijuana to a patient by default who has epilepsy? And the answer once again is I would consider it only if they've tried 2 or more drugs for at least 3 months and have not found a substantive improvement and are still having breakthrough seizures.
Why hasn't a pill form of medical marijuana been developed yet, which epileptics and others can use?
Well, there's an oil form, which is a liquid form, which is essentially like a pill. It's not much different. The question again is why hasn't been a pill form developed? Oil is very similar to the pill. It's just something that you swallow, and seems to absorb better than a pill because of the degradation or the breakdown that occurs in the stomach.
Isn't medical marijuana much safer than traditional anti-epilepsy drugs?
The question is medical marijuana safer than traditional anti-epilepsy drugs? That is very correct. Medical marijuana is safer than anti-epilepsy drugs because anti-epilepsy drugs, the traditional ones, are synthetic and have significant amount of liver toxicity, kidney problems. Many of them do have those problems. The newer anti-epileptic drugs have less of those side effects. However, medical marijuana is a plant-based substance, so the toxic side effects are all, with regards to the liver and kidney, are zero to none. That being said, its efficacy or its ability to control seizures by itself has not been completely proven. It's only been proven in conjunction with other drugs in a syndrome called Dravet syndrome, which is a childhood epilepsy in young kids where they're having dozens of seizures a day sometimes. And it's used conjunctively with conventionally available anti-epileptic drugs.
What are the traditional ratios you aim for when trying to treat somebody with epilepsy with medical marijuana?
The higher CBD ratio, the better, because CBD content is critical in achieving its effect in the brain with the CBD1 receptors. The higher the CBD ratio is better for trying to achieve control in patients with some of the epilepsies that have been treated with medical marijuana.
Do you support people self-medicating using recreationally available medical marijuana to treat their epilepsy?
The question was, do I support people using recreational marijuana to control their epilepsy as a treatment alternative? We can't endorse that because it's not the same type of medicine as medical marijuana, which comes in an oil form. It's slightly different. The oil form is a condensed form of CBD that the patient is getting, so therefore it is achieving higher levels in the brain. There is, however, a lot of data out there of patients who have been treated with several epilepsy drugs and have not found complete control, and just by happenstance started smoking marijuana as a recreational practice and found a reduction in their seizure frequency. What that means that the CBD component from the inhalation of the recreational marijuana does control some seizures, but it's not probably adequate enough to result in a comprehensive positive efficacy. That's why CBD oil was approved in New York State for use.
As a prescriber, do you typically recommend the oil formats or ingestibles?
I typically represent as a prescriber, I typically suggest using the oil format.
What is your feeling about the plant form?
The plant form of the question is, what is my feeling about the plant form? If I understand that correctly, my feeling is that plant form of medical marijuana, which is inhaled, has some efficacy, but unfortunately, it comes with some baggage. It comes with the baggage of THC. It also comes with the baggage of other agents that are commingled with the plant form, which may not be of any beneficial effect or therapeutic effect, but more so creates some toxicities from an unforeseen circumstance. If you want a much safer form of medical marijuana, which allows for control, which allows for comprehensive study which has been done, the oil form is probably the best.
Do you think that the plant form will be federally legalized at any point for medicinal usage?
The plant form at this point in time will probably not be federally legalized. The question once again is, will the plant form be federally legalized? It is unlikely that the plant form will be federally legalized at this time on a nationwide basis. It is highly likely that more and more states will continue to legalize the use of medical marijuana. It may not be that more and more states will continue to legalize the use of recreational marijuana, but definitely medical marijuana.
Do you think eventually pure CBD oils will be allowed to move between states without any kind of
Well, the
police
question.
enforcement.
The question again is, will pure CBD oil be allowed to be moved between states without any police enforcement? CBD oil can be taken by a patient from one state to another as a part of their medication regime. It cannot be transported en bloc for sale from one state to another. That's a completely and entirely different concept. If a patient takes CBD oil or a medication in their bags because they're traveling from point A to point B for a few weeks for vacation, that is considered, as long as they have a prescription for the same, it's considered medical care, and most likely the federal government will not interfere in there. Unfortunately, the federal government doesn't have clear-cut guidelines for those, but at this point, the federal government has not been interfering. That being said, if you were trying to transport thousands of vials of CBD oil from a state where it's legal to a state where it's not legal, the federal government and state governments would probably intervene, and thereby resulting in some form of prosecution.
Are there any secondhand harms from smoking oils or any kind of medicinal marijuana, similar to cigarettes?
There's no secondhand harm from ingesting medical marijuana oil. There is possibly some secondhand harm from smoking recreational marijuana because it's unclear as to what other agents are commingled with it. Because the processing of those plants is unclear, and it's not within the purview of any regulatory agency for the most part.
Are those with prior convictions of like felonies, whether drug related or not, allowed to get medical marijuana?
Medical marijuana can be dispensed to people who have prior convictions. The question is, people with medical marijuana who have prior convictions, can they be dispensed medical marijuana? The patients who have had prior convictions can get medical marijuana. The only problem is that it is a state-by-state issue. In New York State, there is some modicum of a background check that requires patients to be undergone, and it is dependent on the state drug enforcement agency when they do the background check to approve or disapprove the dispensation of medical marijuana to a particular individual.
Are the qualifying conditions the same across all states, or do they differ?
The qualifying conditions are differ from state to state. States such as California that have been allowing medical marijuana for many years compared to New York State, which is a very recent phenomena. Though California has much laxer rules and regulations, and states in New York are slightly more stringent, where it requires patients to actually have certain diseases or fall into certain disease categories, have clear-cut documentation of those diseases prior to being prescribed medical marijuana and prior to being approved for medical marijuana.
Chronic pain was recently added to New York State guidelines qualifying conditions. What conditions do you expect to follow that soon?
So the question is that chronic pain was recently added to the New York State qualifying conditions that can be used for patients needing medical marijuana. And the question is, what other conditions could potentially be added? So some of the other conditions that I believe that will be potentially added in the near future will probably be spinal cord injury, which is a very significant problem, and it results in a significant amount of chronic pain. I believe central pain syndrome, which is a pain syndrome that is derived from trauma to the brain or strokes within the brain, or brain tumors causing the same, will also be added. The other possibilities are some of the end-of-life situations where patients who are in the last 6 months to 1 year of their lives, not because of any particular diagnosis such as cancer or degenerative condition, but just normal debilitation from aging. In order to improve their appetite, they will probably be, and to improve their quality of life, medical marijuana may be added to that group also.
Do you know of any studies that suggest medical marijuana reducing seizures in utero? The studies of medical. The question is, any studies with regards to medical marijuana being used in reducing seizures in utero? Medical marijuana there have been no studies done with regards to medical marijuana reducing seizures in utero, but some patients have, of course, ingested marijuana during that process and have reported a reduction. It is slightly a complicated and risky process, because some patients can cause respiratory depression to the fetus, which can further be a problem. So it is advisable not to utilize medical marijuana or recreational marijuana while pregnant, because of the downstream effects to the fetus is still unknown. In regards to Dravet syndrome, does medical marijuana have any side effects for children when used?
Dravet syndrome is a severe form of childhood epilepsy. Most of those kids are on 2 or more drugs. Many of them are on 3 or 4 drugs for long term. The question again is, does the medical marijuana in these kids have any side effects or long-term effects? There's really no significant side effects with the medical marijuana because it's a plant-based therapeutic agent. It does have the ability to be metabolized through the liver, so it may change the metabolism pathways of other medications that the patient is taking, and could raise the levels of those medications, causing some side effects of those medications. However, in and of itself, it is unlikely to have any significant side effects.
Do you know of any studies in regards to medical marijuana and things like PTSD or depression?
Well, the question is, it's the use of medical marijuana and PTSD. There have been several published data on people who suffer from PTSD who've smoked marijuana and found a reduction in their symptoms, some of their symptoms. Many of these symptoms are overlap to current psychiatric conditions such as anxiety disorder and depression. Medical marijuana has a role to play in that space at this time. There is the possibility of using it in some patients, and I think that's one of the future diagnoses that will ultimately get approved in many states, including New York State. It's going to be a matter of time.
Do you know of any link between marijuana use and psychiatric disorders?
The question is, do we know of any link between marijuana use and psychiatric disorders? From a therapeutic benefit, psychiatric disorders that are non-psychoses, that is primarily anxiety, sometimes depression, panic attacks, those types of patients have been known to report positive effects and positive benefits when smoking recreational marijuana. That being said, some states which have approved medical marijuana for more years than New York State are allowing the use of medical marijuana for patients with severe anxiety disorders, social phobias, and there has been positive reported outcome studies on those.
How many approximately medical marijuana prescribers are there in Brooklyn?
There are several that are registered, but there's only 2 or 3 of us who are fairly in tuned to being able to understand what are the diagnoses, what are the workups that are required before initiating patients into medical marijuana.
So to answer your question about how many registered medical marijuana prescribers there are in Brooklyn, there are several that are registered, but there are very few. There's only a couple of us, 2 or 3 of us, who have really taken the time out to educate our patients, educate ourselves a bit more on the rules, regulations, and the diagnoses that are consistent to be used for medical marijuana. And it requires the physician to actually go through a workup. It's not simply just having the patient come to your office as a patient and say, I have a diagnosis and I'd like medical marijuana. It does require the physician to, one, verify that the patient's diagnosis is true and accurate. Most patients don't have that documentation. It's appropriate to do the documentation, get the diagnostics test done to verify that you really have somebody with a diagnosis that fits the state guidelines. And once that is done, make sure that the patient has no other medical issues and initiate the treatment based on your verification as a physician's diagnosis. And that's a good standard of care.
Does a patient on medical marijuana need to follow up monthly similar to narcotics?
Yes, there's no clear-cut guidelines in New York State, but because of this being a scheduled agent, equivalent to or worse than narcotics, it is preferable that the physician does follow the patient up on a monthly basis for the safety of the patient, because many times the patients take the medication and then find out that later on that the medicine is no longer available to be filled at the pharmacy because they have not had any follow-up visits, and that can become a problem. Because you have to re-certify the need with the state government. So in order to maintain continuity of care, it is probably better to follow up with your physician on a monthly basis in order to be safe.
How long does it usually take to find an appropriate dosage for a patient that works for them?
The question is, how long does it usually take to find an appropriate dosage for a patient that works for them with regards to medical marijuana and a disease state? Both in my experience and the experience that is commonly accepted along the industry lines throughout the country, it usually takes 1 to 3 months of trials. So the first month is a certain dose is tried. After that, a second dose could be initiated the second month. And after the third month, a physician and a patient will probably know whether or not they're on the right track with regards to treatment, or it's something that's not going to work for them.
Do you have schizophrenia is one of New York's qualifying conditions. Do you have any patients who are schizophrenic and you are using medical marijuana for?
The question is, schizophrenia is one of the qualifying conditions in New York State, and do I have any patients who I'm using medical marijuana on for schizophrenia? We actually don't have any patients with schizophrenia that we're using medical marijuana on at this time. But that being said, because of it could be a function of lack of public awareness, because it's just it's a relatively new entrant into the market, medical marijuana in New York State. I would assume that if we were to circle back to that question in a year's time, you would see us having several patients who are schizophrenic with that diagnosis who are on medical marijuana. It would not be improbable.
What is the most common diagnosis that you have prescribed medical marijuana for?
The most common diagnoses that I've used medical marijuana for are multiple sclerosis, chronic pain syndrome from some form of pain, and cancer pain.
How do you feel about synthetic marijuana as a use in epilepsy?
The question is, how do I feel about synthetic marijuana and its use in epilepsy? Synthetic marijuana has probably some role to play. The data is a little murky, has not been completely studied as a conventional agent would be studied in epilepsy. It will probably end up having some similar side effect profiles as the conventional synthetic anti-epileptic drugs, but it's something that could be added to the armamentarium of physicians
line 3?
It could be something that could be added to the armamentarium of physicians when thinking about treating with medical marijuana. So that's it for today. We'll have more updates on different interesting topics. Please sign on, and if you have any other further questions, leave it in the comments, or you can meet us at Read It. Thank you very much.